The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you here again today, where we will bear witness to evolving mind, mood, health. I am so glad that we have a chance to speak today. We have a remarkable author and psychologist, Dr. Arielle Schwartz, who is joining us, generously sharing the 3 books that I've got in front of me right now: Therapeutic Yoga for Trauma Recovery. I've got this fantastic Therapeutic Yoga for Trauma Recovery flip chart, which, you know, if you're a graphic kind of person like I am, I like big images and, you know, simplicity, because it makes my life much easier and it allows my brain to kind of capture things really quickly. I'm a visual person. And then we have this really wonderful book called The Complex PTSD Treatment Manual, an integrative mind-body approach for trauma recovery. Now, the thing that really, really excites me about Dr. Schwartz's work is that she understands how to make sense of what's happening with your body as you face trauma, however that is landing for you. Now, for anybody who knows me personally, you know, I have been studying yoga since I was 16 years old. Yep. And it's kind of a foundation of how I have always been able to regulate myself, make sense of difficult moments in life, kind of face difficulties, you know, just be able to live within my body with a bit of comfort and calm. And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to be able to do, no matter what your background is. But it's only recently, in the last, you know, really in the last 5-10 years, that people have been understanding that yoga can be profoundly helpful to people who are struggling with trauma. Now, there's more and more research on this, but there aren't that many great examples of the use of yoga therapeutically, specifically for trauma. People have been using things like restorative yoga for many, many, many years. And in the tradition that I was trained in so many years ago, it's called Iyengar yoga. Restorative yoga is a very commonly used practice, but it wasn't necessarily brought in with the realization that this was very, very beneficial when it came to actually trauma healing and recovery, and using a trauma-informed approach to healing and recovery with yoga in mind. And Dr. Arielle Schwartz is also really deeply trained and has a deep understanding of the polyvagal theory, which is something that seems to have informed her work. So we'll get a chance to learn a little bit about that from Dr. Schwartz's view as well. Now, I want to encourage everybody who's listening. And hey, by the way, I just want to tell you, we've now tipped over 4,500 live listeners. So if you're out there and you're listening and you find this topic to be of interest to you, of great interest to me, then please email us your thoughts, your questions, your experiences to instudio101@gmail.com. Welcome, Dr. Schwartz. I'm so delighted to have you here today.
Anna, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have a feeling we're going to have a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I do too. And I'm so excited to speak with you because I rarely get to speak with somebody who has a similar background to mine, as in having, been exposed to yoga at a really young age and then used it as a foundation to stay well while they're doing clinical work. And, because as a clinician, you get exposed to, and I've specialized in trauma in my path, in my clinical work and at my clinic, and all the clinicians that I teach and I supervise, we do a lot of trauma work. So being able to always ground with yoga has been honestly my safeguard. And I have to just note your very, very interesting experience. I'm going to take you back a little bit, if you don't mind. And then maybe we could take a look at this and understand how this unfolded in your life, because I want to go from this early moment and then bring it into today, if that's okay with you.
Thank you. Yes. This
is from Dr. Arielle Schwartz's Therapeutic Yoga for Trauma Recovery, and it's in the preface. So I was first introduced to yoga in 1979 when I was 7 years old while taking family vacations to ashrams in rural Pennsylvania and upstate New York. I carry two distinct memories from these trips. The first memory involves sitting in the children's room where I learned about a light that lives inside of each of us, and I felt a sense of warmth and ease settle in my body. The second memory is attending an evening ritual in a large, dimly lit hall that was filled with the sound of people chanting and the scent of incense burning. One by one, people filed toward the front of the room to receive Shaktipat. Now, people won't know what that means, but here it's described, which is a kind of transmission of energy where a guru uses their inner light to ignite or awake another person's inner light. I walked up to the front of the room with my mother and stepfather until we reached Swami Muktananda, who touched the top of our heads with a peacock feather. The next day, we traveled back home, and within a few weeks, our house caught on fire, destroying everything inside. My mother and stepfather had an eerie feeling that the Shaktipat had ignited more than our inner light. Okay, let's start from there. What a story.
It is quite a story.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing me back to it. I have a real tenderness in my heart just recalling that time, both I really can feel the wide-eyed child in me that was exposed to all of that at that ashram, and that moment of walking through the hall and the peacock feather and the guru at the front. And then there was this utter chaos that stood in contrast to that. And in some ways, the chaos preceded that visit to that ashram, because my parents began to separate. My mother and my father, my biological parents, began to separate by the time I was 2, and by the time I was 4, were divorced. And I was moving back and forth between 2 households from a very young age. So in a sense, I already experienced what I would call this kind of fracturing of my world, especially because it wasn't just a divorce. It was a very high conflict divorce in which 2 parents refused to speak to each other than sending notes through me, or very, very high tone, intense arguments would ensue. And so when a child is growing up in that environment and the kinds of fights that were happening in my home, even prior to the age of 2, there is already this sense that somehow the world isn't safe. And then I think that tipping point that happened after we were at the ashram and returned back, and it was my mother's home that I really felt in some ways was my only safe space in the world. And it was that home that caught on fire. And so we had to move out of that home as well. And we were eventually able to move back in. They were able to clean and rebuild, but the sense of almost this quality of an earthquake occurred, a fragmenting of the world as I knew it occurred. And that statement in there of my mom and my stepfather really sensing that somehow the Shakti pot ignited more than the inner light, that it initiated this profound shift in our lives. And I do think that sometimes trauma and spiritual awakening arrive in the same place.
Well, that is a very interesting concept, and certainly one that I have heard from a number of people that I've interviewed on the very topic. And there seems to be a kind of awareness that sometimes when we are exposed to very, very terrible things, they have a way of cracking us open in the most unexpected ways and allowing us to become kind of embodied with something that goes beyond, I guess like a standard, like life has been okay. There's a lot of comfort. When we experience terrible times and great discomforts, we certainly have to dig deep. And sometimes in that digging deep, something else cracks open and, allows us to be in some ways more connected with absolutely everything that is around us in the most remarkable ways. So I've heard that from a lot of people. Now, in your experience, from the book, you actually didn't stay with any kind of practice of yoga until you were older. Can you tell us a little bit how you kind of went back into yoga and what that meant for you in terms of your personal life, your professional life?
Yeah, yoga was playful as a child. It was a place that I got to just be in, almost like another world for a little while. I could pretend to be a tree and a camel and a cobra and, and all of those things. But then, I became a teenager. I walked away from it, and because of the experiences I had as a young child growing up across these households and so forth, there was a lot that was going on at my father's house that for me left me feeling profoundly unsafe. But it accumulated for me, certainly by my mid-teens. I went through a phase of feeling suicidal. I went through a phase of my own depression, my own anxiety. By the time I went to college, I experienced tremendous social anxiety that was interfering with my overall sense of self. And I thankfully, entered therapy at that time. And likewise, I also was kind of dragged by the arm by a good friend of mine to a yoga class. And the two concurrently, being able to attend to my inner world with a very compassionate present therapist, and then also being able to get on my yoga mat and breathe and move and have this return to an experience that eased up that anxiety, that quieted that ruminating mind and that self-critical mind, so that I could feel more at home in myself. And once I tasted that again, I think I was probably about 19 or 20. Within a year, I had a daily practice. By the time I was 23, I went and did my yoga teacher training. All I wanted was to keep returning back to that feeling because it was such a lifeline.
Mm-hmm. That is such an interesting story, Arielle, and I have rarely heard of another person who has found that so young in life and made it a regular practice. That is not typical. I'm not typical, but when I hear that, I do recognize for myself that if I didn't get as deeply involved in yoga as I had become. And I mean, I've been practicing every day since I was about 16. And I didn't, I mean, obviously, you know, a person might take a break if you're sick or something like that. But the daily practice piece is what I want to focus on, that, you know, there's something about it, regardless of what you're facing, that creates this embodiment that allows not only for the delights and the pleasures and the excitements and all of that, but also potentially the pain and the suffering and the truth of, you know, what might be happening in this world, on this planet. And, you know, with that in mind, I want to read something else. And this comes from an email that I received from you. And it is titled Tender Reflections on Global Events. Is it okay if I read this?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, it says, fear and the unfathomable darkness. It all feels so surreal. I think to myself, I am a trauma expert. I should know what to say, how to help, what to do. I feel survivor's guilt. How can I be away in a place full of beauty while others suffer? Family, friends, and anyone impacted by the profound tragedy and acts of violence that accompany terrorism. In this situation, I know that you're speaking about the Israeli-Hamas war, and I'm not saying Israeli-Palestine for a specific reason. I see it actually as very precisely Israeli-Hamas. And just for our listeners, there's a reason that I'm phrasing it in just that way, because I think it's important to understand that what is happening now is a response to acts of terrorism, and Hamas is an organization that is identified as a terrorist, a global, not just Palestinian, but global terrorist organization that has chosen as their charter. And again, most people don't understand this, but Hamas has a charter that basically says, you know, our mandate is basically to kill Jews everywhere. And, you know, what an awful statement. That's their charter. So the Israeli-Hamas war is a fight against a terrorist organization. So just so people understand that is my take on it. So now I'm going back to your letter, Arielle. Sorry about that. And you write, you quote Albert Camus, who states, sometimes just carrying on is the superhuman achievement. This morning I sat with my little girl, the one who was once afraid of the dark, tucked in the recesses of my heart. I took her hand and held her tight. I realized that the answers never come with expertise. They come from allowing myself to sit in the darkness with the most frightened parts of myself and others. And as I greeted my fear, I felt a settling in my heart, in my belly. A small rivulet of tears softened the shock and returned me to my own humanity. Fear gave way to grief. Here I stand inside the courage to attend lovingly to fear inside of the unfathomable darkness. From the courageous heart in me, I bow to and honor the courageous heart in you. So I was just really moved by this. And by the way, I'm also familiar with Thomas Hüvel's work on collective trauma. So I just wanted to mention that is important work. Well, let's talk about collective trauma in a minute as well. Thank you for emailing that. It was so beautiful. I wonder, you know, how yoga helped you face that.
It's interesting. I think about something that occurred for me last week. It was a week ago Monday, shortly after all of this had begun, and it was maybe I'm trying to orient time-wise. Time gets funny in times like this, but it was maybe 6 days or so after the attacks, and it took about that long for that degree of shock to start to subside. And I was on my yoga mat, and yoga in that moment didn't look like a series of poses. It looked like a willingness to show up for myself, hand on heart, hand on belly, and to breathe, even though there was part of me inside that felt very collapsed, very shut down. And the courage that it takes to breathe in the midst of that, to breathe into what initially felt like numbness, and how numbness rolled into contraction and tightness and pain. The courage to then breathe into pain, to trust that there is, in some ways, the mat represents that which holds me, that which is bigger than me, that helps to hold me in moments of turning towards discomfort, pain, fear, terror, anger, rage, right? All of the emotions that can go in that can show up in these moments. And then that tightness began to move into my heart, began to move into my throat. There was a wail that needed to be expressed, just this wailing. The mat can hold that too, right? So even though, yes, I can step up and out of that and move into a warrior pose or move into, something that resembles yoga and an asana and a practice, in its heart, there's a way in which as what you read reflected, I'm attending to my internal system in the most honest, authentic, compassionate way. And even though that wail of grief that was finally coming out of the frozenness and the shutdownness was painful and difficult. And my husband was actually next to me and at some point just came and held me, which was profound, right? But there was, on the other side of that, an opening to also feel that my open heart at that moment could also sense beauty, belonging, connection, and even just an okayness, or as you read in the Camus quote, just the willingness to put one foot in front of the other and to just simply be. And I don't think that we're meant to just relate to pain alone. I think that as a trauma survivor and as someone who works with trauma, if all we look at is the pain, it becomes all that we can see, that we learn to do this practice of holding both and, whether it's holding pain and holding possibility, holding grief and simultaneously finding something that helps us feel just even the ounce of gratitude, or sensing hurt and beauty simultaneously. That is what yoga is about. It's about union of opposites at its core, and sensing that somehow our capacity to hold the both and is what facilitates wisdom or wholeness or compassion.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like a real gracious way of recognizing. I like what you said, holding both and. Just the realization that there can be this sweetness when we leave space for the pain, and when we are no longer battling ourselves to suppress all of that. And yoga allows for that with a bit of grace, not entirely and not necessarily in the moment. I want to read through some of the questions or comments that we're getting already and see how we do with it, if that's okay with you, Arielle. This one is from Sue, and Sue says, "Hello, doctors. Are all yoga classes therapeutic? I'm not sure what this actually means. So could you help our listener to hear from your perspective?"
Yeah, it's a great question. I think all classes have the potential to be therapeutic, and yet I think it really depends on what feels safe for you and what feels that it gives you enough space to actually show up authentically, fully you. And for some people, that's possible within a vinyasa class. For some people, it's more accessible within a Kundalini class. And for others, it's a restorative and slow kind of yin style class that allows us to feel safe enough to come into the truth of who we are. But I would say for myself, I have certain core principles that I would look for in terms of what makes yoga therapeutic versus perhaps a set of aerobic exercises or a set of, postures that we're meant to follow in a sequence. The first is that there's an encouragement that you are your own best teacher, that you are listening within for what is right for you. And that the invitation becomes this kind of journey of honoring the cues that you're receiving from your body and your mind and your breath and your emotions about how do you best take care of yourself moment by moment, so that you are now honoring your own body, your pace, your breath, what is needed, and that there is full permission to do something completely different from the person next to you or other people in the room, that you don't have to basically be in the Simon Says game where the teacher says do this and therefore I have to do that. Because if that's not right for you in that moment, then we're actually putting ourselves back into this certain set of kind of machinations that we do in the world at large, which is trying to fit in rather than actually sitting in the ground of this deep self-acceptance. So if you feel safe to explore, to go inward, to really listen to yourself, then that's the therapeutic basis.
Beautiful. Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting thing when we start to recognize that learning how to find that place within inside of ourselves, sometimes it can unfold over time. It's not necessarily an immediately available position. We don't necessarily have this thing called wisdom in the body right away when practicing yoga. And for most people, we start with a place of, I'm actually just going to practice that pose. I can barely even get it together. My husband started to practice yoga about 5 something years ago, after many years of kind of watching me do it and kind of going yeah, that's her thing. And it's so remarkable watching him head off and gaining this real kind of increased awareness of how his body works and how emotion lands in his body, which I think was something that came quite a few years into practicing, that he was just doing these postures and he used to say, oh, look, I'm so good at my balance. And it wasn't until he'd been practicing for a few years that he started to say, I can really feel how whatever it is he was experiencing is kind of landing on my body. I could notice it when I'm practicing, and that was a really new and different thing. So I think it's really beautiful when this kind of change happens over time. This one is from Ken, and Ken says, wow, what a story. I love Dr. Schwartz's work. Blessings to you. So that's just a nice thing to hear.
That is lovely, Ken. Thank you.
Yeah, this one's from Mark, and Mark says, listening along today, I'm wondering how body movement, yoga with mindfulness impacts the enteric nervous system.
Ooh.
Yeah, I just saw that. That was really good. So, yep, you got a plus sign on that, Mark.
Good. Yes, absolutely. I love the question. So let me just start for our listeners that don't know what the enteric nervous system is to define it for a moment. So the enteric nervous system is the gut belly nervous system that we have learned that not only does our traditional brain and our that we all think of as the center of our nervous system that is in our head, produce neurotransmitters that are then, kind of helping us respond to the world, go into states of excitement and states of relaxation, producing all of the neurochemicals that balance out our emotions, such as serotonin and GABA and dopamine and so forth. But that actually the research on the gut is that we have a second brain, the belly brain or the enteric nervous system, and that our gut is producing the very same neurotransmitters and hormones that are produced in the brain itself. And so what's also really powerful about our gut is that our gut is responding to the world in a very instinctual, intuitive manner, just in the way that, in a sense, where animals are responding to the world. We have a very kind of primitive nervous system response that's going to identify very quickly through that gut feeling whether something feels good for us or harmful to us. So if you think about how your gut responds to what you ingest in food, right? Your gut's going to be able to help discern this is nutritious and this is waste, or this is toxic and poisonous. And we'll have some pretty simple responses to that, either absorption, elimination, or excretion in a more extreme sense, either up and out or down and out when something is toxic for us. But emotionally, we are also ingesting life experiences. And when we've experienced chronic stress that can impact the health of our gut, when we experience trauma that can impact the health of our gut, and trauma in itself is a toxic experience as interpreted by the body. And so it's not uncommon to feel nauseous, for example, when we've experienced something shocking or traumatic. Your gut has again a very similar parallel way of helping you get something out. Where it gets really confusing sometimes is when we've grown up, let's say, with relational trauma, and we've had to make something toxic palatable, okay enough, when we've basically had to absorb into us things that our gut is saying that doesn't feel safe or that doesn't feel good, but I still need to let these people care for me. They're my parents. I still need to attach to this person. It's my primary caretaker, even though they scare me, even though maybe they hurt me. So then our gut belly wisdom actually gets kind of skewed or confused. And in one way or another, whether it's relational trauma, chronic stress, or single incident trauma, part of where we want to go with yoga is restoring or reclaiming that instinctual relationship, this instinctual embodiment of yourself, where you are now practicing on the yoga mat, listening to what feels good and what feels not so good, or what doesn't feel right for you. And then you get to honor that on the yoga mat. There's another beautiful yoga teacher and writer that applies yoga for trauma. His name is David Emerson, and worked with Bessel van der Kolk for many years and in a lot of research on yoga and trauma. And I think one of the beautiful things that David would say is that yoga is a practice in making choices, and that every moment by moment on the yoga mat, you are now listening within and saying, what feels right to me? Would I like to engage in this breath practice? Would I like to engage in this asana? How do I honor my body, very basic communication of yes, and my body's very basic communication of no? And that I'm now going to restore and recalibrate how I am listening to that deep instinctual knowing. And now we're doing something new in the gut, where rather than overriding that gut belly wisdom, we are creating more of an authentic relationship within yourself that now is listening. And when we look at how we're restoring the enteric nervous system, we're creating more health of that belly-based wisdom. It's a lot about that willingness to go back in and say, I'm sorry that I stopped listening to you. I'm sorry that I pushed you so hard, that I kept filling you with more and more and more, and I didn't let you digest what was happening, right? When we get overstimulated and we crave more overstimulation, or that I was starving you for so long of nourishment and attention, right? So that we can actually reclaim, in a sense, the gut can also be thought of as our inner child, and that we are, via the body, reclaiming a relationship to self.
Wow. I love that. Gut as inner child. And this whole idea that, those toxic experiences are interpreted by the gut, and then the gut responds with something somatic, something that is bodily felt or experienced. And you had reference, potentially chronic or relational trauma, but there's also this whole thing of collective trauma that we're experiencing right now. And a lot of people who maybe aren't experiencing something personal, they might not have anybody in danger, they may not have lost anybody during the pandemic, none of their family are facing war, they don't have anybody in Ukraine or in Gaza, or they don't have those connections, may still also be looking at the world and experiencing things in the world right now that are igniting all sorts of discomforts, and it's hard for them to place it because it's not necessarily their story, and yet they're experiencing something. And I would imagine that the somatic or the body lived sensation could be giving a lot of people a lot of trouble right now. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So when we are tapping in at that collective level, our collective trauma is also very deeply tied to another related concept, which is the generational or transgenerational trauma. And even though you yourself may not be directly related to the conflicts happening on our planet here and now, first of all, we're all exposed to them on the news or in social media. If we're orienting in any of those directions, whether it's images, whether it's stories that we hear on the radio, whether it is, something that a story that gets shared via social media. So many of us are being, in a sense, kind of cued into these threat responses within ourselves on a daily basis, just because it is surrounding us. It's the ocean we're swimming in right now. We are living with so many active cues of threat that are around us. And even if we are not conscious of how we're responding to those cues of threat, sometimes our bodies are still internalizing that, still going into these contractions or these responses that then over time accumulate. And the next thing you know, we feel exhausted, or we get sick, or we have this grief. We don't even know why we're feeling that way, but it's an accumulation of so much that we're being exposed to. And if we lean into that generational trauma layer, there's both the collective of the fact that we are so deeply connected to each other, but that we're all children of children. We all have ancestors behind us that in some way or another, most of us have ancestors that at one point had to flee their country of origin, or that were persecuted in some way or another, or that were persecuting others. And so we may sense into that kind of fibrous cellular memory of the ways in which those that came before us have had to navigate the world that was unsafe for them as well. And so now we have not only our own response, whether it's directly known or unknown, but we may be kind of loaded with this generational or collective memory of times in which our ancestors didn't feel safe. And I think that what's happening in, as you named, the Israeli-Hamas war and conflict, this is such a core conflict for our world right now, as well as Ukraine and Russia. These are core conflicts that are occurring in places that have so much historical trauma. And it is, I'll speak for myself as a Jewish woman. It's been stirring, these events have been stirring those deep, profound generational roots in me. They're pulling at things that my own nervous system knows, because my own grandmother experienced profound trauma with her mother, and so on and so forth. One of those stories that I'll share very, very briefly here, Anna, is that when the war on Ukraine began, my grandmother's family was from Kiev, and the Jews were being placed in pogroms in Kiev back in the 1890s. My great grandmother was pregnant with my grandmother when she had to leave her family behind, and with the two older children who were ages 2 and 4, and then being pregnant with her husband, left her country to a new country where she didn't speak the language, where she didn't know anybody, and gave birth there to her third child, separated from her parents, from her whole family, right? And we can only imagine the impact that had on the attachment that my great grandmother had with my grandmother. And then it impaired the attachment my grandmother was able to have with my mother. A beautiful side of this story, if we were to hold a little bit of that both and the glimmer of hope in the midst of these painful stories, is that my mother did some 20 years of her own therapy, right? Like, she was so committed to her healing journey and creating something new, breaking a pattern so that she could help free me. Did she free me of those generational wounds 100%? No, because they're bigger than her. They're significant, but enough that it's allowed me to do my work in the world and to have had enough foundation under me that the trauma didn't overwhelm the resource.
I am blown away by all of that. That is just so incredibly profound, and the recognition of how the past pours into the present, and how we can face the things that are happening today and not fully comprehend, if we haven't done our work or we don't know our history, what is pulling on us. So for those people who are listening today, if you're feeling that something's pulling on you, and you're kind of going like, what is going on? I feel so off, or I feel so exhausted, or my stomach is aching, or, something just feels wrong with inside of me, just to, recognize, how are you going to leave space for that? And Arielle, I know that you have some really beautiful practices in your book that reflect on breathing, and also the asanas, which are basically the poses that a person might take that hold certain forms within, the tradition of yoga. But you go even further than that, and you really kind of draw on the philosophy, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And can you just spend a few minutes and help our listeners to understand, what does this mean? Ahimsa, asteya, aparigraha, brahmacharya, satya, socha, santosa, tapas. Why do these things even matter? So, I'm going to give that back to you, because there's a lot of these paths and limbs and tracks, and I have been studying, like I said, for a long time, and I still haven't wrapped my mind around all of it.
Yeah, well, I'll define as many of those as I can here. I think what I want to name is that yoga not only gives us it's an 8-limb practice, right? There's 8 limbs, and asana, or the physical practice of yoga, is only one of those limbs. The pranayama, the breath work practices, is another one of those 8 limbs. But the first 2 limbs are what we call these ethical guidelines for how to live a moral life. And the ethical guidelines are called the yamas and the niyamas, and these are the first 2 limbs. And they are about, how do we relate to ourselves, and how do we relate to others, and how do we relate to the world around us in a way that doesn't create more harm. So ahimsa, for example, kind of loosely translates as nonviolence, and nonviolence in our actions towards others, nonviolence in our actions towards ourselves, in how we speak to ourselves, even in our own thoughts. And so that we can it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect at this, right? But that we are aiming true, we're aiming toward cultivating a kinder, more compassionate, more generous relationship to ourselves, the people around us, and this planet that we share. We know that we as humans have had such a huge footprint on this earth and have really contributed to climate change and to the imbalances in our world. And so the ahimsa reminds us to be mindful, as well as aparigraha and some of these others that are about how much do we take and how much do we need, because we can get caught in these feelings of greed and never enough. All of us can, right? It's part of a trauma response. It's part of just a human response. And so we aim to only take what we really need. So we refine our actions in the world. Satya, for example, is about truth telling, being authentically true with ourselves and the people around us, not truth in a way that could be harsh or mean, but truth even going back to, is this really what I need right now? Is this really going to serve me right now? How can I refine my actions and what I'm doing in the world to be more in alignment, so that I can again be kinder, be gentler. It allows us to really slow down and live that more mindful life.
I love that you include these philosophies in your book, because it really raises this idea that, we can embed with some guiding principles that may help us during these really complex and messy times. Yeah. I want to go back to our listeners and look at some of the other questions that we are getting. First, this is from Dawn, who says, how actually does yoga help with mental illness? Isn't it more physical than mental?
Yes, and right, that like part of what we're doing in yoga is we're cultivating mindful movement. So it's not just the posture itself, although the posture can be empowering, can cultivate new states of mind, but it's about the intentionality that we bring to the practice, whether it's that intention of kindness and compassion, whether it's an intention of being in the moment, of catching where the mind tends to ruminate on the past or generate worries about the future. And mindfulness is about being present in the here and now. So if you imagine that your mental processes are kind of like wild horses. We're pulling those wild horses into the corral. We're training the mind to be more present, to be in service of. Eventually, we put those horses on the chariot and we are holding the reins so that we can actually direct our mind to take us in a direction that's going to best serve us in the world, right? So that rather than being pulled by the wild horses into places of darkness, places of despair, hopelessness, what's the point? It's not going to make a difference. Places of aggressive thinking. All right. Now we are actually in charge of this chariot that we're riding, and those horses are in service of us. I can direct my mind into compassion, gratitude, goodness, appreciation, the capacity to be really present with another person and listen deeply, which is one of the best gifts that we can give.
You talk a lot about breath in your book, and you give a lot of examples of practices. I want to get to that, but before we do that, I want to just quickly say, this was from Bill, who says, are Dr. Schwartz's classes on Zoom free? I don't know the answer to that, but maybe you have some videos that are out there that you can share with our listeners, or a place where people can get resources, and you could speak about that.
Sure. So, Bill, and everyone, I created what I'm going to refer to as my pandemic project, which is that for the longest time, my classes were here in Boulder. They've almost always been donation based. I really am a believer in yoga being something that is from the heart, and that we give back from the heart when we receive that gift. And so my classes continue to be donation based. But when the pandemic happened, the classes that I was teaching locally in my community here in Colorado became more widely available because I placed them on Zoom. And there's an easy thing we can do with Zoom, which is to press a record button. And so then I started to upload my classes to YouTube. And so those classes, there's now over 120 classes or so that are up on YouTube. They are freely available. If people feel moved, I encourage you to give from the heart, which people do. And I have received donations from people for these freely available classes from around the world, and I'm so deeply grateful for that. But I'm equally grateful for the fact that they are freely available to people around the world who maybe don't have the resources to donate even $1. And so it becomes a way that we all kind of collectively offer and serve. So my students, in fact, I'm teaching one this Saturday. My students come in, I teach the class live on Zoom. Again, it's a donation-based class. And usually there's about 100 people that pop in from around the world to these classes, sometimes more. And we practice together. And that class then gets recorded and put on YouTube. And but part of what's really special about attending a live class, just as you're experiencing now with attending a live radio show, is that there is a sense of community that happens. And there is something so important to know that there's other like-minded people that are seeking to heal, whether it's chronic stress or trauma or just the challenges of being human, by coming together in community and being willing to move and breathe and intentionally be together.
I just went to your YouTube channel, and it's Dr. Arielle Schwartz, and there are 177 videos. And I would encourage anybody who's interested to try to watch some of the videos that are already there, or maybe get involved in some of the programs that are available, especially if you're interested in using yoga for trauma recovery, being aware of the books that she writes, you know, the flip chart, which has these wonderful images. And, you know, if you're a clinician, certainly the complex PTSD treatment manual has a lot to say about trauma recovery. And, you know, one of the things that we haven't really covered is the vagus nerve, Porges work, vagal toning, and your thoughts about how, you know, that plays into yoga, and why Dr. Porges thinks that what you're doing with yoga is so great.
Yeah, thank you. So I first started learning from Dr. Porges, who's the founder of the Polyvagal Theory. I started first learning from him in the early, maybe like 2012 or so. And then more recently, I have partnered with him. And for the past 4 years or so, we have been partnering together of bringing the applied polyvagal theory in yoga or therapeutic yoga for trauma work together. So I work with his institute, the Polyvagal Institute, and also with the Embodied Lab to bring the applied polyvagal theory in yoga model out there. So what is polyvagal theory, right? If this is totally new for some of us, and what is the vagus nerve? So the vagus nerve is our 10th cranial nerve. It's this mind-body superhighway of communication that connects that enteric brain that we were speaking about, the belly brain. It connects to heart and lungs. It connects all the way up through the larynx and pharynx in the throat, and all of the muscles of your face that help us socially connect to each other in the world. And what's so key about the vagus nerve is that it plays a very central role in our mental health and well-being, as well as our physical health and well-being, and balancing out the neurochemistry of our body, balancing out our sleep-wake cycles so that we can be alert to get exercise and feel motivated during the day. And we can also move into deeply restful states when it's time to sleep at night or to meditate, and that we have those rhythms of regulation regulation in our autonomic nervous system, those same rhythms of regulation are actually necessary to facilitate the health of our digestion, to facilitate the health of our respiratory system, our reproductive systems, our immune system. So it's a full mind-body health facilitation. And why yoga is so beneficial within the polyvagal arena, and there's a whole lot more I can say about polyvagal theory in another time, but what I'll name now is that why yoga is so beneficial is there's this recognition that the breath is the most immediate and fastest way to create balance in your autonomic nervous system, and that how we're breathing and the rhythms of our breathing create this coherency, create this health of the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic. And if we're stuck in an imbalance of the autonomic nervous system, sometimes we're stuck in the go, go, go state of just being stuck in the on mode, that sympathetic, we can't slow down, we can't rest. Sometimes we get stuck in what we might call the off mode, where we don't have motivation, we are in fatigue, we feel shut down or collapsed. And we don't want to get stuck in either of the expressions of either of those branches of the autonomic nervous system. What health represents is an integrous capacity to have homeostatic balance between both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the breath is the fastest way to achieve that homeostatic balance.
I always felt lucky that I had learned from the great teachers that I had in yoga to work with my breath. And I love that you recognize it as the best route to settling the bouncy, jumpy elements of a nervous system that has been triggered in some way. Do you have a practice that you can describe to our listeners? We've got about 4 minutes left, and I would love to capture something that you think is a wonderful option for people who'd like to learn how to practice.
Yes, I'm going to teach you the basics here, which is that the most basic go-to breath is in the yogic system, what we refer to as samavriti, or the same movement. Sama being same, vriti being movement of the mind and movement of the breath. So samavriti pranayama is breathing on your inhale the same length as you breathe on the exhale. Every inhalation activates our sympathetic system. Every exhalation activates the parasympathetic system. And so as we breathe in equal measure, a 4-count inhale and a 4-count exhale, we're facilitating a balanced nervous system. And you can extend that to a 5-count inhale and a 5-count exhale, or a 6-count inhale and 6-count exhale. One last thing I'll say in our brief time here is that experiment for yourself. There's beautiful research out there, a great book by James Nestor called Breath that teaches about this breath practice I'm describing. And there it's called resonance frequency breathing. And as we practice that same length inhale and same length exhale, we are also creating this kind of equal movement of the mind. We're equalizing the autonomic nervous system. But if you're someone who's keyed up in that sympathetic state, in the go, 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 let your exhale be longer than your inhale, and it will start to slow you down.
I love that. Yes, absolutely. I've been teaching breathing practices to my clients and my students for as long as I have been a psychologist. And, you know, one of my favorite practices is just to count. And it doesn't matter which breath practice you look at, but just to count as you notice the breath entering and you notice the breath exit. If you could do that 20 times in a row and actually stay connected to your breath, I mean, that kind of awareness can allow you to not get into that argument with your neighbor, or, you know, have a poor interaction that you would rather not have, or have you, you know, move out of a state of agitation after watching some news and into a more settled state. You know, I just think it's so it's so beautiful to add these practices to our lives, especially while we're going through what seems to me a heightened collective trauma globally, in which people are aware of our vulnerability, of the pain and suffering, and I would just ask everybody to leave some space for that. And, to also check out Dr. Arielle Schwartz's YouTube channel, take a look at what she's done there. There's a lot of videos to pick up a copy of Therapeutic Yoga for trauma recovery, if that's something that really resonates with you. This whole idea of the polyvagal theory and how it really is at the core of our functioning. The flip chart, which I thought was absolutely lovely, and the complex PTSD treatment manual, if what you're ready for is bringing this kind of work into your trauma practice, if you're a clinician or doing this kind of work. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and really, really appreciate the work that you're doing out there and the unique role that you have in bringing forward this wisdom. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Anna. I experience this time with you as profoundly generous. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well. Bye, everyone. I'll look forward to speaking with you next month.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here